The Trump administration announcing new sanctions against Russia over the use of a military-grade nerve agent on UK soil. And new information this morning, Moscow is upping the ante in the response. Moscow says it will cut holdings of U.S. securities. Let's bring in California Congressman Ed Royce, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Chairman, good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Good morning, Maria.
Your reaction to Russia's response, cutting U.S. securities?
Well, I don't think that that reaction is going to be too effective in terms of our market because of their de minimis position in it. But what I do think is we saw on Friday a new two-year low for the Russian ruble. And at the same time, as the administration makes its case, and they were right to move forward on these sanctions, they're pointing out that the Russians in this case were caught red-handed. The British have films that show the Russian perpetrators, and so with that evidence and with these new sanctions, on top of the sanctions we've already placed on Russia because of their ongoing efforts around the world, not only to engage in undermining democracy, including here in the United States, but also their actions in Syria, this represents considerable leverage right now on Putin. We are sending the message to Putin. The administration is sending the message, you will pay a steep price for your continued intervention in our elections and for your other actions, such as this attack on British soil.
So walk us through these sanctions and how impactful they may or may not be on Russia.
Certainly.
Why do you think they're so stinging?
Well, first of all, these sanctions impact export and import. They impact electronics. They impact aviation. The second tranche of sanctions, which will go into effect in 90 days if Russia does not curtail these activities, could potentially affect the ability of Aeroflot to fly or land anywhere in the United States. And so the cumulative effect on this is really, really having a hit, not only on the value of the ruble, but on the Russian economy in general.
You know, I remember that there was a story during the financial crisis in 2007 where Russia, Vladimir Putin, called up the head of China and said, maybe we should get together and sell U.S. securities. Now, this was a rumor. It was actually in Hank Paulson's book after the crisis. He was talking about putting enormous pressure on the U.S. while the U.S. was down. We were in the worst financial crisis in a generation in 2007. So now we hear this again, that Russia is, in fact, going to sell U.S. securities. How much of an impact will that have on the U.S.?
Not much of an impact. And in the meantime, the U.S. right now, we've had the largest wage growth over the last 10 years. We're experiencing that now. We've got unemployment under 10%. The economy is under 4%. Unemployment is under 4%. The economy is growing at plus 4%. And so in this situation, our economy is very strong. The ability of Putin to have much of an impact on it is not much. And in the meantime, I think it's very important we be consistent in sending this message that Russia will pay a steep price if these deadly acts aren't answered by Russia. Russia has to take action now in the next in the next months in order to try to reverse its actions and send a clear message that they're not going to continue to do this.
Sanctions also against Turkey this past week. We know that. And I want to ask you about Iran as well. Your thoughts on the U.S.'s move, given the pastor that has been held for so long in Turkey, in terms of applying these different sanctions to Turkey and Erdogan?
Right. Well, Pastor Brunson has been held over 2 years. I think that in terms of tariffs should be very narrowly deployed. And in my opinion, tariffs should frankly be focused right now on Beijing for their violations. I think that the types of sanctions that are effective on Turkey, the focus on the human rights violations, holding the pastor for more than 2 years, and therefore the sanctions against Turkish Turkish officials for human rights violations. I think that's effective. But if these tariffs become too widespread, the use of tariffs, that can have other impacts globally. And so I'd keep that focus narrow and on Beijing.
Well, it seems that the administration they're waiting for Turkey's response. I mean, during my exclusive interview 2 weeks ago with the Vice President, Mike Pence, he told me that the U.S. is serious and wants Turkey to understand we want change. Listen to this.
He wants to come home. And Pastor Andrew Brunson should be freed and should be allowed to return to his family, to his home, to his church and his nation in the United States of America. Transferring Pastor Andrew Brunson to home arrest is just not good enough. And the United States of America is prepared to bring sanctions against Turkey until Pastor Andrew Brunson is free.
So should we expect more with regard to Turkey?
I think these bogus charges brought against Pastor Brunson have to end. He has to be brought home, and I think that Erdogan's authoritarian moves need to be countered. And so, as a consequence, I think he can expect more pressure, and I think it is in international interests to have Erdogan cease holding Americans as hostages, including our NASA scientists there. Well, so I think he's going to face additional pressures.
Let me turn to Iran. What can Congress do? What role do you see in terms of Iran and the U.S. now? I mean, the president has been adamant, very strong against Iran pulling out of that deal. And now we see Iran not going back to the negotiating table, not really thinking that they're going to change their behavior as a result of the U.S. pulling out. And we still have questions about Europe and European companies doing business in Iran. What's next?
So our main problem with Iran, the main problem with the agreement, was that it did not include missiles, if you'll recall, nor did it include Iran's terrorist actions. And so as a consequence, you had the Ayatollah saying every military man must help us mass produce intercontinental ballistic missiles. And you saw the missile test here recently in Iran. This needs to be addressed. And one of the things we were trying to do was to get the other partners in the agreement. And I think we were, the British and the French were being helpful. Germany was not, in terms of getting an agreement in which we address these other issues that were not in the original agreement, and we did something about 12, 13 years out in the agreement. Everything's sunsetted. So we had to address this sunset, and we could not get Germany to go along on that. Now additional pressure is being put by the administration directly on Iran. And you see it's coming at a time when there's widespread disruption across the country in cities all over Iran.
That's right.
You see people going to the streets in protest. So we're turning up the pressure.
Yeah, and let's not forget the impact that it's had on Turkey. I mean, last week, big week in Turkey, obviously. The Turkish lira plummeting down big last week, impacting all markets across the world. Erdogan also threatening to withdraw from NATO. So we see a real impact in terms of markets in Turkey. I wonder if we're going to see that kind of an impact on some of the other detractors, perhaps Iran, or, I mean, Iran's economy obviously hasn't moved and it has plummeted. But do you expect further fallout in that regard?
Yes, just as you've seen a 41% drop in the lira in the last year in Turkey, we're seeing a similar impact, and we're seeing hyperinflation in Iran. And we're seeing it on the streets in terms of people's frustrations with that ideological regime, that theocratic regime. Two-thirds of the people in Iran want a democracy without a theocracy. We need to do more social media into Iran. The Persian community around the world needs to broadcast in and continue that dialogue with the next generation of young Iranians.
And of course, we're also seeing an impact on Russia's economy as well. Mr. Chairman, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Chairman Ed Royce joining us there.